It's no secret that the iPhone SE has brought the mid-range and more affordable smartphone segment to more people's attention, but in plenty of markets outside of the US, there are contenders that are attempting their own takes on this low-compromise package. And depending on where you are, the returning Poco brand might be the smartphone that is best equipped to challenge the iPhone SE. This is Pocketnow and I'm Joshua Vergara. What's going on, everybody? This is the iPhone SE up against the Poco F2 Pro. One of the fun parallels about these phones is that they are both drawing on particular parts of smartphone history. The iPhone SE's inspirations are pretty obvious. It's got all of the old school tropes, a tactile home button, Touch ID that it provides, huge bezels as a result, and perhaps most importantly, a smaller size. Now don't get me wrong, a smaller phone is always a refreshing prospect because high-end smartphones these days are all about the latest and greatest and, let's face it, biggest screen specs. But I will admit, some out there probably won't appreciate how the viewing experience is shrinking down accordingly. Now, thanks to the Bionic A13 processor, this phone can still handle any game or any media that you throw at it, but the handling might feel a little cramped. The screen is still high quality, at least in terms of what Apple has been putting out for years. The 4.7-inch Retina IPS display is ultimately still great with colors, detail, and contrast. But the very things that the iPhone might lack are addressed in one way or another in this Poco F2 Pro. Let's start off with the design. Poco went with the glass-on-glass design that most flagships do utilize by default, so it's not like there's a radically different look or feel. In fact, this phone will look virtually identical to the Redmi K30 Pro, which kind of makes sense because both brands are under the Xiaomi umbrella. In any case, Poco sports some other significant extras like a headphone jack, an IR blaster, and most notably, a pop-up camera. This is exactly where Poco's blast from the past design derives from. This right here is 2019's unique trend of hiding the front-facing camera so that the dream of an all-screen front can be realized. And I have to say, it's been great to see it back. Think for a second how 2020 has been all about the punch hole, and then in the context of this comparison, Apple has never even gotten close to this kind of screen experience. So it's really dope that the Poco F2 Pro is all display all the time. A 6.67-inch AMOLED display that includes even more features that Apple hasn't attempted yet. For example, an in-display fingerprint reader, and then as you can see here, an always-on display. So yes, the phone might be a little bit unwieldy for some, but compared to plenty of other behemoth phones that we've used this year, Poco put this F2 Pro in a pretty good middle ground. All games and media still look great on here, with nothing notching or hole punching into the content. And honestly, the pop-up camera is a design flourish that I always appreciate, especially in this case because it makes Face Unlock a little more fun with extra bits of customization. Oh, and by the way, Face Unlock, yet another feature missing from this iPhone SE. Okay, it might sound like I'm harping on what the iPhone SE lacks compared to this Android competitor, but it's not to say that the general experience is bad. Most of what makes an iPhone is still here. It's just that most of the features that this Android competitor might have happen to be things that Apple have yet to attempt at all in any of their phones. But where it truly counts in the iPhone SE is in the internals. The Bionic A13 and 3GB of RAM are perfectly suited for everything you might install in iOS and everything that you might get from the App Store for a typical work-life balance. I keep using the quality of life phrasing because Apple didn't skimp on certain features from the flagship lineup. You have water and dust resistance, you have fast charging and wireless charging, and they all elicit the same general response. You know, back in 2016, I probably would have killed to have those features on the iPhone 6 or 7 at the time. Now granted, that's also because the iPhone SE's battery life is a little bit too much like it was back then. Users will probably end up searching for a cord or a charging mat well before bedtime. So there's no doubting that Apple have done right by prioritizing the right stuff right now. The difference here, however, is that Android OEMs like Xiaomi and thus this sub-brand Poco have been doing this for years. We love the iPhone SE for bringing a somewhat fresh and affordable version of iOS, but in plenty of markets around the world, Android has been easily accessible in so many different affordable ways. So yes, the Poco F2 Pro might be more expensive in most markets, and it's certainly more expensive than the original F1, but it still achieves the same everyday flagship experience for a price that undercuts many other top-of-the-line offerings. And in that way, Apple and Poco seem to have very similar missions. It's great that Poco got the Snapdragon 865 and at least 6GB of RAM in here with a 4700 mAh battery that can last a day and a half until needing a charge via 30-watt fast charging. The pop-up camera does mean that the Poco F2 Pro loses IP certifications, but I would have to admit that the thing that stings me a bit more is the loss of convenient wireless charging. Now on the software side, the discussion of Android versus iOS is always a bit weird and futile. If you're considering the iPhone SE, know that iOS is pretty much exactly how you would expect it. MIUI does add in a dedicated theme engine as well as a game turbo mode that stops notifications from interrupting your enhanced Snapdragon gameplay. Can Android operating systems get a little too far into the weeds with their feature sets? Absolutely. That's one of the reasons why iOS is the champion of use it because it's simple and it works. But that just points to another truth about Android versus iOS. If you're already into it, you'll probably stick with it either way. And in either case, these two phones happen to be good representations of their respective daily software experiences. Camera discussions that include the iPhone SE are always interesting because the iPhone SE just has one camera on the front and one on the back without many extra bells or whistles. Granted, the Bionic 813 provides some software backup for things like portrait mode and better HDR. The iPhone SE sticks with a single 12-megapixel rear shooter and a 7-megapixel front-facing camera. With a little bit of creativity, features like 4K 60 video recording and Apple's portrait mode will give you some room for fun. But putting this camera up against the Poco F2 Pro shows the obvious holes in both camps. See, the Poco's pixel-binning 64-megapixel main sensor brings in some good-looking results that sometimes make it a toss-up between both phones. The other sensors include a depth sensor for portraits, a 13-megapixel ultra-wide, and a 5-megapixel macro. You see, I meant it when I said you could get fancy or you can get kind of weird. Ultimately, the 5-megapixel macro lens is a bit of a surprise though because it gets some great shots. And at 5 megapixels, it's already over twice the quality of the common 2-megapixel offerings. Now the front-facing cameras are a bit more of a disparity as the Poco F2 Pro hides a 20-megapixel shooter with more beauty mode options. Both selfie shooters can only go up to 1080p video though. Speaking of video, Poco takes pages out of Xiaomi's book by including little additions like a movie frame mode and a vlog mode that guides you through filming and creates a stylish highlight reel. This is all on top of the phone's own 4K 60 and actually 8K video recording. I don't think I would really call 8K a true win in the Poco column though, just from a practicality standpoint. And speaking of practicality, the one thing missing from the iPhone SE camera is a night mode. This is still a little bit of a head scratcher, but in comparing this phone's low light shooting to the Poco's night mode, I found some interesting results. It seems that the Poco is able to make something useful compared to the iPhone in the darkest of situations, but if there is even just a little bit of light, the iPhone is still able to eke out something visible. I attribute this to two things. The iPhone has a sensor capable enough of flooding in enough light, while the Poco just doesn't have a good enough night mode compared to other high performers we've seen in other phones. Apple's quality in photo and especially video is still hard to match, but it's unfortunately limited because of the iPhone SE's singular approach. Meanwhile, the Poco F2 Pro has good enough quality across the board, but it provides you with some more choices to get fancy or weird while you're snapping away. The philosophy behind the iPhone SE is kind of simple. Find the aspects that can be dialed back without sacrificing, in particular, the day-to-day experience. For a lot of people, that would be iOS. It's for that reason that the iPhone SE is so compelling because most other phones in the same price range skimp out on those key internals. Meanwhile, here comes Poco with a similarly priced phone that still has the top specs you might expect from an Android device. You see, it seems to me that Poco has this whole price is right mentality. You have a price in mind and then you try to mash in as much as possible without going over. Meanwhile, Apple honed in on minting the basics. This is a phone that just works with a little bit of nostalgia sprinkled in. I know I'm supposed to have a personal pick here, but honestly it's hard because these phones manage to hit pretty much every note that they're aiming for. In 2020, it's been rare for a phone to prioritize the most basic aspect of a smartphone, the viewing experience. You're looking at the screen all the time anyway. Notches and hole punches are small annoyances that are then amplified when screens like this one actually arrive. It just so happens that nearly every other essential part of this phone, well, maybe minus the camera, have been met. So because I do want to have a good viewing time because it's what I do the most on a phone, I would take those cameras for their good enough quality and enjoy myself on one of the few large and totally in-charge screens that we've gotten so far this year. And so there you have it, a comparison between the Poco F2 Pro and the iPhone SE. These are two budget devices that are trying to provide the highest end experiences they possibly can. In iPhone's case, it's trying to do so by prioritizing iOS. After all, it's what you use most on the daily. The same goes for the Poco F2 Pro though. They've managed to provide the right specifications for Android while prioritizing mainly this viewing experience. That's why this pop-up camera is a thing. But I do want to know what all of you think. There are certain markets where only one of these phones is available, but in the markets where both of them are, there are times when the prices actually line up. So we thought this might be a good comparison to have. Let us know which one you would pick in the comments down below, and at the very least, drop some likes on this video and subscribe to the Pocketnow channel if you haven't already. If you're new here, thank you so much for sticking around. From there, we're going to go ahead and call it on this one. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in our next video.